Now, in June 1971, the BBC broadcast a programme that provoked one of the biggest political bust-ups in the BBC's history, Yesterday's Men, a fast-paced, irreverent programme attempting to give an insight into the post-government lives of the Labour shadow cabinet. Today, we live in a world where public servants must declare their earnings and any private interests. Politicians are treated with little or no deference. But in 1971, a politician's earnings were still forbidden territory. Yesterday's Men was famous, perhaps infamous, not just for what was broadcast, but for what wasn't broadcast, and which then found its way into the press. Even before transmission, Wilson was angry. He threatened libel action to ensure a question on his earnings was cut out, and it was. Open warfare with Harold Wilson followed the programme, and the BBC eventually agreed not to repeat it in his lifetime. So here, for the first time since it was originally broadcast, is the programme that caused all the fuss, Yesterday's Men.
Like Humpty Dumpty, he sat on a wall, giving the orders, and then, in the midst of it all, he had a great fall. Now he's one of yesterday's men, one of yesterday's men, one of yesterday's men, one of yesterday's men. The yesterday's men, and it's no fun at all, getting sacked and put out to grave. Yesterday's men will be happy until politically they are today. Today, 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 today.
I think you adjust very quickly. If you're in politics, you expect to have periods on the government side and periods on the opposition side.
Oh, I think, yes, great humiliation. It was very unexpected, certainly to me, and I don't believe anybody who says they expected it.
It was a sudden turnaround of expectation, and I wouldn't deny for a moment that an hour before I felt more confident than I normally feel when going into election counts.
So I was looking forward to a change of job, and it was a great shock.
One's first feeling, of course, in the morning after is sheer exhaustion, physical and emotional exhaustion.
My colleagues in the Home Office, who I'd worked with, the civil servants, were very kind enough to give me a party a few days later, and we all had a jolly party. It was a mixture between a sort of a funeral wake for the old minister and the king is dead, long live the king for the new minister. Maudling wasn't there, but I felt his spirit was presiding over the place, rather.
You suddenly realised you hadn't got an office to go to on the Monday morning, for example. You actually hadn't got any work to do on Monday morning. I think it was a gradual realisation as you saw the pattern of life changing. And then, of course, as soon as Parliament met again, you discovered that a lot of other horrible people were announcing horrible policies, and you realised very rapidly.
Nothing deader than a dead government. And the Labour government is dead and buried.
Labour has now been a full year in the wilderness. Perhaps the worst is over, the harsh rediscovery of what it means to be out of power. It was a year to be got through rather than lived, a year when the other people made the running. Politics is severe on those who fail. They're left to kick their heels and wait and watch the others have a go. For Harold Wilson, who assumed so much of the credit and took so much of the blame for what Labour did in office, this has been a time for stoicism, a time spent learning to accept his fate.
The lesson this evening is taken from the 3rd chapter of the book of Ecclesiastes. To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven. A time to be born, and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to get and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away. That which hath been is now, and that which is to be hath already been, and God requireth that which is past. Here endeth the lesson.
For 6 years, Harold Wilson enjoyed the limelight that shines on prime ministers. But inevitably, when the job was taken away, he seemed ordinary again. Even in the Scillies, it was different.
During the years he came as prime minister, there were the usual trappings of high office, secretaries, detectives, and all the complex telecommunications equipment which had to be installed before he came. When he arrived by the steamer, there was usually quite a crowd to see him, and he signed autographs and posed for holiday makers to take snapshots. The chairman of the council and other local officials always came to the quay. His friends still go to meet him, but the atmosphere isn't quite the same. I suppose there isn't the glamour attached to being leader of the opposition as there is to being prime minister.
We're not the big shots anymore. Where are the autograph hunters? Yesterday we were front page news. Now there's only the past to confront us. There's only the past to confront us. There's only the past, there's only the past, there's only the past.
It's difficult enough, I think, for a minister, for a politician who wants to do something in politics. It is several times multiplied the case with a former prime minister who has lived in number 10 Downing Street with all the services that provides, who's had all the fame and attention and everything which goes, and the power which goes with being prime minister, to suddenly find himself the leader of the opposition. Mr. Wilson's a very resilient, resourceful politician, and he's still a formidable House of Commons man, there's no denying that. He has adapted himself less. His touch doesn't seem to me to be quite what it was. He does seem to spend an enormous amount of time justifying the role of the previous government. I sometimes wonder whether they shouldn't have, in addition to Prime Minister's questions, which take place in House of Commons twice a week, they shouldn't have Leader of the Opposition's questions, in which questions are asked about the previous administration.
Oh, Harold. I think, he was shell-shocked. Absolutely shell-shocked. I mean, think of the shock of, first of all, no chance of winning, and then winning, and coming back from Liverpool. It was the most ghastly shock for him.
I've been told by several of your colleagues that the defeat really hit you worst of all. Do you think that's true?
No, I think probably it hit them, many of them. I was always ready for it. You must be in this job, and indeed I was in '66 when I thought we could have lost then. No, there are a lot of legends about it and press stories, but I adjust very quickly to things. I mean, by that same evening, on the Friday evening at Chequers, I was roughing out the chapter headings for a book I thought would be useful to write, which I've written.
Richard Crossman said he thought you suffered from a period of shell shock when really your mind wasn't on the day-to-day job of leading the opposition.
But it was, as I say, I was on the job Friday afternoon with the chairman of the party. And I called a meeting of the old inner cabinet on that day. And throughout, I just kept in control.
Radio 4, the time is 8:30. Time now for any questions, and so we join David Jacobs.
And this week we've come to the heart of the City of London, to 20 Aldermanbury, the hall of the Chartered Insurance Institute. And on the team, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Labour member for Stetchford, the Right Honourable Roy Jenkins.
Freedom from office gave the freedom to talk. Senior ministers, prevented by their jobs from writing or broadcasting, came back to it in droves. It was a poor substitute for action, but a balm to their damaged self-esteem. But it's not simply that they felt an urge to speak out. They badly needed the money they earned by doing it.
Does the team agree with Dr. Johnson that we would all be idle if we could?
Mr. Henderson wants to know if you agree with Dr. Johnson that we would all be idle if we could.
The desirable position I think probably to be in is to think you want to be idle.
With enforced idleness, a minister's salary drops £5,000 to just over £3,000. Broadcasting helps, but he'd have to appear 3 times a week, 52 weeks a year, to make up the balance.
So I couldn't begin to live on a Member of Parliament's salary and at the same time have a full-time secretary as I do, and run the car that's necessary and do all the other things that are required of a Member of Parliament. It did mean a cut of 2/3 in my salary, and I suppose a cut of half in the actual take-home pay after tax. Yes, I had certain problems there.
Oh yes, considerable. I mean, there's a very big difference. And you have probably worked out a pattern of living which is not extravagant, but which is comfortable and convenient for the work you have to do. If you're going to be late at the House of Commons night after night, you must have a London base. But equally, if your home is outside London, as ours is, in the country, then to maintain the 2 homes on a member's salary, just asking to get into trouble with one's bank.
Have you actually been able to get back to the level of income you were at before? What have you done to supplement your income?
Writing.
Mainly writing?
Writing and, you know, talking to chaps like Dimbleby on the television, things like that.
Have you been able actually to get back to the level of income you were at before?
No.
I'm luckier probably than most because I have a wife who's a journalist and who earns. The MP's salary, that doesn't amount to anything by the time you take all your expenses into account. And apart from that, I've earned a certain amount on freelancing, on writing and television and so on.
Well, I've done television. Look, I'm doing it now. I've done a certain amount of articles, but basically I'm engaged on writing a book.
Most of us live up to our incomes, but lifestyles effortlessly acquired aren't easily given up in the lean years of opposition. In office, James Callaghan bought his 138-acre farm near Lewes. Roy Jenkins invested in a country house with tennis court and croquet lawn in a secluded Berkshire village to add to his imposing London house in Ladbroke Square, although his books help make ends meet. Anthony Crosland bought a fashionable London house when Labour won in '64. But in '71, it's meant an overdraft.
It is a very expensive place to run. I bought it only on the supposition that I was going to be a cabinet minister. I don't want to have to look for a job just like that, because I find that being a shadow spokesman for a large subject is virtually a full-time job in itself.
Tory ministers out of office get lush pickings from the city. Were you and your colleagues offered jobs?
Very few. I suppose it's partly some general instinctive prejudice against Labour politicians.
We used to earn what the rich man earned, but now we're reduced to the rags. We go on telly to pay the rent, and overdrafts from the banks, 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 and
Only Harold Wilson became richer in opposition. Using his privileged access to government papers, he wrote 300,000 words in 6 months about Labour's time in office. The extracts from the book have been criticised, both for their obsessive self-justification and because of doubts about whether Prime Ministers should profit so soon from the secrets of their governments. The serial rights of the book have certainly made him rich. During the year, he bought Grange Farm in Buckinghamshire, and in Lord North Street, Westminster, a distinguished house within easy reach of the House of Commons. With the bungalow in the Scillies Road Inn, it makes his properties alone worth over £60,000. Mr. Wilson earned 6 figures for the book, but what those figures are remains a closely guarded secret. Why did you think people would be interested in reading about your years in office?
Well, for one thing, I believe that for those 6 years we got a pretty ropey account of what we were doing from the press. I mean, it was an almost totally hostile press. I thought it was right to set the record straight and right while it was fresh in people's minds. Secondly, I think everyone wants to know what really happened. Look at the interest, for example, in Mr. Harold Macmillan's review of the first 2 years of his premiership, his memoirs, which I recently reviewed. Now, people are interested to know what really happened.
But it's something people usually do when they've given up politics as a practicing profession.
I would propose to do that when I give it up. But, of course, Winston Churchill, David Lloyd George, Clem Attlee, when he was still leader of the opposition with another election fight ahead of him, all wrote books. I think it's important that people show the true record of a period which was not at all fairly reported.
Is it proper for a man who hopes one day again to be Prime Minister to write in the way that you have, in particular about the civil service?
I don't think I've been rougher with civil servants in what I've written in public, and I'll stand my corner on it. And after all, people can write to the press if they disagree, as they do.
You've also called Ian Smith a liar, which must surely rule out the possibility of any further talks with him.
No, I said some pretty strong things about him before the Tiger talks we still met, before the Fearless talks we still met. No, I've just set out the fact.
The party political broadcast has a special importance for oppositions. Just being seen on television is valuable enough, but 10 minutes of peak time viewing, which they control, is a rare chance to appear as an alternative government with a programme and people to carry it out. But using television to carry this message is notoriously difficult.
Right.
Stand by.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, fade up and cue.
I think people sometimes turn off party political broadcasts because they seem to give too distorted, too unfair, too partisan a view of the facts. The Conservative broadcast last night, for example, it was very slick, but it gave so distorted a view of what Labour had done that it surely couldn't.
An opposition is desperately concerned to maintain its credibility in the public mind. The textbook explanation of their role is far from the truth. In theory, their job is to modify government legislation and prepare alternative policies. But in practice, as time goes on, it gets harder and harder to look like an alternative government. Memories are short, and those who've gone out of power are quickly forgotten. The government does its best to keep things that way. The interest of press and television, in action, not words, makes it doubly difficult for an opposition to arouse much public interest.
Well, opposition is very frustrating. It's a role that's got to be fulfilled. After having been in government, it is, of course, a desperately frustrating role. First of all, seeing the government take what you believe to be totally wrong decisions, as over the Third London Airport. And secondly, the very limited effect that you can have on government thinking by making speeches or writing articles or whatever it may be. You do your best to influence it, but you don't basically influence it. And this, as I say, is extremely frustrating, assuming that you're in politics because you actually want to do things and not just for the pleasure of listening to your own voice.
But listening to the sound of its own voice is about all an opposition can do until the next election. Sitting on the wrong bench, even if it's the front bench in the House of Commons, is no substitute for doing the real job. The exhilaration of government is replaced by the monotony of formal and largely fruitless debate.
Is my right honourable friend aware that I'm getting rather bored hearing answers time after time on the line?
The honourable and learned gentleman said that preambles had gone out of fashion. I beg to give notice that I shall pursue this matter.
The pump has already been done.
I hope that the committee will leave the wording of this subsection unaltered. Simply for the reason that it doesn't matter a jot.
What about Terry Kelly?
I did not say that. What I said was the same in substance as what I've always said, and that is what my view is.
Resign!
I think it's frightful. I think many, many ex-ministers will tell you that they find it almost unbearable. You think at first there's going to be some crisis to save you from it. Then there comes the terrible grinding moment when the ex-ministers know they're ex-ministers, they've forgotten their jobs, they've lost contact with their ministries, they're just front bench opposition politicians, and they've got to stick it out. And the life isn't going to be in the House of Commons, the life is going to be in Transport House across the road where the new policies are being made, or outside in the country. And they'll have to go on with these formal to and fro debates and try and get into the press and know that these damn ministers can get into the press because they're doing things. You see, no press just hates you just talking. The press wants you to be doing, and governments do, and oppositions just talk.
You don't feel, as some of your colleagues do, that the work of opposition in Parliament is a charade?
No, I don't think that's true of our political system at all. You're not just there to oppose or to try and to stop them do things. You're there to put the constructive alternative first in parliamentary debate and then in the sort of programmes and policies that the opposition, Conservative or Labour, are putting forward for the next election.
Did you find it difficult to adjust, in personal terms, to adjust to actually sitting on the opposition bench?
I haven't tended to sort of gravitate to the wrong bench, if that's what you mean, or to the wrong room, I mean, as between the Prime Minister and the opposition's room. I think they had more difficulty, didn't they? They kept on calling me Prime Minister for about the first 9 months.
What was your reaction to that?
Amusement.
You feel regret, but I don't feel, I don't feel any kind of sentimental nostalgia. Mine is rather an impish amusement. Perhaps I see the lights burning in 8 St. James's Square in the early hours of the morning, and I can just visualise what is going on while some great issue is being argued about. There's some great industrial dispute or other, or there's some great pay claim. And I know just the sort of pressures they're working under there.
For Barbara Castle, the pressures of decision-making have gone, but she has to work just as hard. No opposition in the world is so starved of resources as ours. They've no research staff, no office space, not even secretaries. A minister, on the other hand, has civil servants always at his beck and call, preparing speeches and drafting answers. But his shadow opponent is still expected to catch him out. Barbara Castle, preparing her case against the complicated Industrial Relations Bill, was on her own. On the 21st of February, 125,000 trade unionists marched to Trafalgar Square in protest against the Industrial Relations Bill. It wasn't a happy day for Labour. The Tory plan for reform was the biggest political controversy of the year, and an issue calculated to cause the Labour Party the maximum embarrassment. In office, they themselves had fought hard for trade union reform, and though they were forced to drop their proposals, the attempt still rankled with the unions. Even though the Tory bill differed from Labour's in the methods it proposed for union reform, Labour now had to convince the country that its opposition wasn't dog in the manger, but a genuine disagreement. They weren't helped by the trade unions pointedly excluding them from this protest rally.
But they will never again split this trade union movement into 2 classes. We will not accept that there should be a licence for one to speak and no licence for other people.
The outcome of the debate in Parliament was predictable enough. The Labour front bench was taunted on all sides with its own unsuccessful proposals by Tories and their own backbenchers alike. There was also the problem of who should lead the attack. Could Barbara Castle, who'd fought such a battle with the party and the unions over her proposals, now convincingly change her tune and unite them all against the Tories? Many people thought a new face was needed.
Well, this is what the government hoped, of course. And there were a lot of people on both sides of the House who were astonished when it was made clear I was going to lead the attack. And of course I could have moved to some other job on the front bench. And I took, therefore, in a way, I suppose, a political gamble in being absolutely determined to go ahead. I don't think I would have got away with it if my intention had not been to reveal differences I genuinely knew to exist between my proposals and the government.
Why Mr. Wilson agreed to this, I don't know. Some think that it may have been simply that in the aftermath of the election, where he may have been in a state of shock to some extent, or that his mind was on other things, such as his memoirs. But she is a very, very persuasive woman, and I think if she went to him and insisted, she's also a very senior and able member of the party, if she went to him and insisted, he probably felt that he couldn't very well deny her the job.
You must take Harold as he is, with all his strengths, and he has some weaknesses too. His strength is this wonderful way that he lets you get on with the job. And once he's appointed you, he doesn't fuss you, he trusts you, and he lets you get on with it. And the compensating weakness for this is that he is profoundly reluctant to have rows or disagreements with his colleagues, and he is extraordinary sensitivity to this. Harold really dislikes hurting his colleagues and dislikes thwarting people he's fond of, and therefore when Barbara insisted, as I think she did, I suppose he just agreed. And I think it was a mistake, if you ask my opinion.
No, she didn't insist. Indeed, she and I had both agreed that if we won the election, she was going to other fertile fields. No, Dick's got that wrong.
Harold has asked me many times when we were in government to take on difficult jobs that I didn't particularly want to do. And in return, he would very genuinely leave choices to me on a thing like this. You say, if you want to move, Barbara, well, move. Or do you want to stay? And I say, Harold, I want to stay. Right, he said, the decision is yours. I back your judgment. And that was the sort of relation I had with Harold.
I think myself, if say, Jim Callaghan had taken over the job on the Industrial Relations Bill from his position, which was, of course, quite a different position of not being in favour of the bill, I think we would have been probably more effective in a sense and less confusing to the public.
Do you think that Barbara Castle, after the battle over in place of strife with the unions, was the right person to be leading effective opposition to what the Tories were introducing?
I think that that's not the sort of question I'm ready to discuss here.
The reassuring words of the old song and the jollity of the Scilly Islands Labour Club can't disguise one uncomfortable fact, that wherever a defeated Prime Minister goes, whatever he says or does, his party is always wondering if this is the man who can win them the next election. During the last year, Mr. Wilson has been criticised for his lacklustre performance in the House and on television. And if there's at present no direct challenge to his leadership, there are contenders waiting in the wings, and some who would certainly like to see him go. But the problem, as always, is to find someone better than the man you know.
Then we shall all be 8 in May on airplane for my dad. Then we shall all be 8 in May. Then we shall all be 8 in May. Then we shall all be 8 in May. On airplane for my dad. On airplane for
I think Harold Wilson is the most skilled leader the country has seen for many years, and in my view, he would be the best leader of the party. He is a young man still, energetic with all the tenacity of a Yorkshireman, and with all the grit for which he's not been given sufficient credit. In my view, I would expect to see him leading us into the next election.
I think he would like to win the next election. He's by far the most popular man in the leadership of the party, not only with the party but with the public. And as long as he wants to do it, I think we'd be crazy not to accept it.
I'd be very surprised if he didn't. Mr. Wilson's a very young man to be an ex-Prime Minister. He's strong health, and I think his interest in politics remains strong.
Have you considered retiring since the defeat?
No. You mean within this Parliament? No.
Do you consider ever whether the party would benefit from new leadership?
Well, obviously, I've had to consider that many times in the past, including the time when we were in office. I haven't seen any general desire. I read little, stories from time to time, and nor any general desire to appoint X or Y as my leader, as my successor as leader.
There is always a leadership question in the Labour Party, in the sense that there are a number of people who would be strong contenders for the leadership were there to be a leadership question. Now, in the Conservative Party at the moment, there's no leadership question, but there's also no leadership question because there are no contenders. The Prime Minister is not threatened at all by anybody at this stage. In the Labour Party, it is not like that. You have James Callaghan, you have Roy Jenkins, and you have Dennis Healey, to name only three, who, if Mr. Wilson were run over by the proverbial bus or taxi or whatever it is, would be candidates.
If the big red bus knocked old Harold down, they'd be rubbing their hands with sorrow, shedding crocodile tears, they'd fight all the way to be number one man tomorrow, to be number one man tomorrow, to be number one man tomorrow. And yesterday's man, and it's no fun at all, getting sacked and put out to graves. Yesterday's men will be happy until politically they are today, 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 today.
Oh, it was certainly among my ambitions. It wasn't an ambition for which I would have knifed anybody in the back or gone round manoeuvring particularly, but I imagine if you're in the position that I was fortunate enough to be in, namely to be one of the leaders of the party, that you would be rather an odd person if at some stage you didn't say, well, I would be very happy indeed if I were leader of the party. But don't think that I go around bearing a grudge or I've got a permanent chip on my shoulder I'm trying to brush off because that opportunity didn't come.
Callaghan now, Jim. I think sometimes he does and sometimes he doesn't. Depends on whether he's fallen in love with his farm again or not. He's the only other farmer apart from me, and he has this curious sense of an alternative life. Callaghan's the most inscrutable, of course, but then he's the most accomplished politician of the lot. And you'll never know about Jim. I sometimes wonder if he knows it himself. But I think he's available. He's available.
He's got a good, solid base in the trade unions and in the party organisation. He would be a very strong candidate. But every day that passes, I think, reduces Jim Callaghan's chances. He's getting on. He'll be a man of 60 by the next general election. He'll be over that sort of age limit. Now, admittedly, we've had prime ministers who've started at considerably older than 60. But I would think these days this must be a disadvantage to him. I think if there is an heir apparent, it's now Roy Jenkins.
I would say that the steady growth of Roy Jenkins in the confidence of the party is the remarkable fact. Ever since he took on the job of deputy leader, he really has dedicated himself to the rather unrewarding job of being there, and I think he has built very strongly his position as the number two to Harold. Not only ambitious, but a man who concentrates his energies on achieving his ambitions. He's a man who likes to be indolent, likes to have time off, likes to enjoy himself. And therefore, he can't waste time on activities which don't help. He's the most concentrated politician. And a man one of the most consistent politicians. His character, and he's developing, I think, a very strong character, and a character of a man whose eyes are kept to that goal and with extraordinary tenacity, which I couldn't possibly observe.
Many people have been saying and have said to me that you are Mr. Wilson's heir apparent. Do you have any comment on that?
No, I think it's very difficult for me to have any comment on it if it were true, and I'm not sure it is true. A lot of these prophecies tend to be self-defeating, and I certainly have no comment, and I'm not preoccupied by this.
You once wrote that a combination of long life and persistent ambition allied with adequate political talents is the best recipe for leaving a big imprint on events. Granted, you can't control the long life and you have the adequate political talents. Do you feel in yourself that persistent ambition?
I wrote that about Asquith. I've always tried never to get obsessed by politics, because I think if one gets obsessed by politics and thinks one's life is politics and nothing else, and if politics goes wrong, one's life would be dismal, hardly worth living.
You haven't quite answered my question. Assuming you do want to leave a big imprint on events, do you have that persistent ambition at this point?
I'm not sure. I find it much easier to make these judgments about other people than about myself.
Are you ambitious to be one day the leader of the party?
I've really said everything that I have to say about the subject of ambition. I'm afraid I'm not prepared to answer that.
The third candidate is Denis Healey, who is a very formidable and a very ambitious man, who I think does see himself as Prime Minister material. The scenario there, I think, would have to be one of deadlock, or at least of a conflict between Callaghan and Jenkins, with Healey as the middleman. But Healey's claims, I think, will perhaps advance as Labour continues in opposition. While Labour in office, he suffered from being a one-job man.
As you said, Mr. Chairman, I spent the 6 years when we were last in power as Secretary of State for Defence.
In office, Denis Healey looked like a technocrat, but he's using opposition to display a useful flair for the common touch that the Labour Party loves.
In many ways, I felt my job as Minister of Defence was rather like having a love affair with an elephant. It involved a great deal more pain than pleasure. I was in constant danger of being overlaid. And if I ever did conceive a good idea, you know, it took 27 months to bring it to birth.
Would you agree that you've become better known to the public since you went into opposition?
Yes, in a sense. I think the best sign of that is on these polls that my name never used to figure, and now I trickle around somewhere at the bottom of the list.
So that opposition, in fact, has been gratifying to you in that sense?
Well, gratifying is the wrong word. I mean, this, of course, is inevitably a useful thing for a politician, but none of that is half as nice as taking decisions which have some meaning for the country. I always feel, as a shadow minister, very much like Achilles, who was met, you remember, by Odysseus in hell. In the old Greek fable of the Odyssey. And Odysseus asked him what he felt about it, and Achilles said, "I'd rather be the meanest swineherd on earth than king of all the shadows." And I feel that very much too.
I really like that quote, because I wanted to go on to talk to you about being king of all the shadows.
Oh, yes, well, I shan't have anything to say on that.
People have said to me that you're the most ambitious of all the top rank of the leadership of the Labour Party. Do you think that's a fair comment on you?
It's a very surprising one, I think, to anybody that knows me well. Whether it's fair or not, people have a right to their own views. I wouldn't have said that ambition was a driving force in me at all.
Labour's first year in opposition is ending with what promises to be a lively and dangerous battle over Britain's entry into Europe, because they know that the time is fast approaching when they must decide where they stand.
You can't send Harold on the box to be asked, well, now, what is the view of the Labour Party, and for him to say, well, it's a free vote. You see, some of us will do this, and some of us will...
What I'm saying to you is the idea the party should be denied coming to a decision is absolutely ridiculous.
Nobody suggested that.
Yes, they do.
Oh, forgive me. You missed the whole point.
Oh, you want us to come to a decision?
The whole point is...
And then you want us to say you may vote against.
No.
I will.
An argument at a New Statesman conference, typical of many going on in the Labour Party. The common market question and the deeply felt differences of opinion it evokes can no longer be avoided. At worst, it's feared that the argument could lead to the bitter division that so discredited the party during the 50s. Labour is now as much concerned with how it will emerge from the decision as with what the decision will be. Will it come out of the debate looking like a party that can take power again? How badly will the leadership be divided, with Callaghan already taking one view, Jenkins and Healey another? As the moment for decision approaches, the positions they hold are becoming clearer. But the man at the centre, the man on whose judgment the future of the party hangs, is still playing his cards close to his chest.
I think, for example, on the common market, there's about a third of the party would like me to come out absolutely positively and say we must not go into the common market. That would be a breach with the line we have taken in the past in government and indeed in opposition. I think another third of the party would perhaps prefer me to come out and say almost whatever the terms are, we should go in.
Millions of people in Britain must have been very surprised to hear that the language of Chaucer, of Shakespeare and of Milton must in future be regarded as an undesirable American import from which we have to protect ourselves if we're to build a new Europe. We can agree that the French own the supreme prose literature in Europe. But if we have to prove our Europeanism by accepting that French is the dominant language in the community, then my answer is quite clear. And I will say it in French in order to prevent any misunderstanding. Non, merci beaucoup.
You've always been a staunch supporter of entry into Europe. Is that an issue on which you're going to have to stick to your guns, whatever the party decides?
Well, I've always believed in sticking to my guns on issues. I don't think I'm unique in this sense in any way, but I think that that any politician, if he is to be taken seriously, both by his own party and by others, has to be prepared to stand by what he believes in. And I don't think this is uniquely the case in relation to Europe.
If it came to the crunch and Labour decided as a party to vote against entry to the common market, would you nevertheless be prepared to vote in favour of entry?
Yeah, I always, I never believe in answering hypothetical questions. I've told you my basic view on this issue, which remains my basic view.
Isn't there a danger for you that over the issue of the market, you may inevitably be seen by people as the leader of a faction that's opposed to the leadership of the Labour Party as a whole? Inevitably as the leader of a faction?
I hope not. But there are dangers in politics the whole time. Politics, in this sense, is a very hazardous occupation, and there are very few periods when one's not facing quite considerable dangers. If one wants to avoid all dangers of this sort, one should avoid politics.
But you look as though, from the look in your face, you rather relish the dangers that the common market may propose.
No, I don't relish dangers. I don't like gunfire. Sometimes think one has not to turn away from it.
Don't shake hands with me, I'm a Conservative.
Well, I want to shake hands.
Through and through and... Oh, what on earth are you doing? I'm a very...